Well, let's do that. Well, and let's just give a second here for Jeff. I don't know if you had the opportunity to kind of watch our previous session, get caught up there, but or read through the back end of chapter 5, but give you a second here if there's anything that you wanted to add, correct, or clarify from what we discussed last time. We'll give you the
Um,
freedom to do so.
I didn't really get caught up with where you guys were last time around. Um, I had like 3 weeks in a row traveling,
Yep.
and the conferences are great. The traveling sucks, though. It really does. And especially that first week when I was in South Dakota, we had snowmageddon here in Alabama. We got 3 inches of snow, and the whole southeast, shut down. I think the weather was better in South Dakota than it was down here.
Exactly.
And then I made it to Sioux Falls Airport, and then made it to Minneapolis, and then of course Atlanta was shut down. It took me 2 days to get home from Minneapolis. So,
Oh, geez.
uh, and then turn right around, had a couple days in the office, turn right around the next week, and then a couple days in the office, turn right around the next week. So that and preparing materials and making flights. Sorry, I didn't get caught up on what y'all did last week.
No, totally fine. Wanted to give you the opportunity, so
What
jump
is
into
there
chapter 6.
anything in particular you'd like me to you'd like to ask me
Monument
about it?
Mockingbird is also is a monument have been played in.
Um, I don't know that I had anything in there that popped out or anything we needed to readdress there, but anything from
Okay.
the group?
I know we didn't do it justice. We definitely didn't do Lucas justice, but we did get through it. There was a
Yeah.
lot. There was a lot to digest. Um, but I was trying to think if there was any kind of highlights. Obviously, a lot of the case law at the back end, but mm, nothing I can think of either that jumped off the top of my head. But
No. Okay. Well, we'll jump into
Okay.
chapter 6 here. There's always so much, and that's the challenge of particularly this book, but most of the stuff we cover is any one of these subtitles really could be an hour-long class um, for the uninitiated, and the balance between those that are experienced and bringing some wisdom to this, and those that want to learn more. So, I mean, with that in mind, we'll just throw that caveat back out: is please do ask questions if there is anything in here that we need to spend more time on. Our goal is definitely to get through the book, but get through and like Trent said, do it justice. So with that, we're in chapter 6 here, monuments and corners. And just to kind of start off here, we'll get into this a little bit more in a second, but what I really appreciate about this chapter is we get a little bit of a reprimand. We use these two words very interchangeably and casually, and so we need to be careful when we talk about monuments versus corners and what they are. And so this chapter talks about a bunch of different types of monuments. And so when we think of monuments, when we use that term, that is the actual physical monument in the ground. The brass cap that denotes the section corner, the rebar and cap that denotes a property corner, the axle wheel, the whatever it might be, even the natural or artificial monuments, calls to a road or a river or a fence line. Those are physical monuments that in person, in real life, represent something that might be described in a description or a survey on paper. And so we'll use monuments often and mean corners. We'll say corners and mean monuments. So corners being the theoretical on paper, the corner. The chapter also talks about kind of the corner of two lines, right? The intersection or the angle point or the, those types of changes in a bearing as a corner as well. And so maybe that helps us to be a little bit more precise in what we talk about from here on out, is keeping that in mind. That might help some surveyors understand the pincushion effect when we talk and really delve down into the true meaning of a monument versus a corner. Just because their theoretical or calculated corner does not fit the monument that's out there, the monument has weight to it, and so it's important to denote the two, and why we perhaps hold the monument over the theoretical corner, because that has been relied upon and witnessed by the landowners. So,
TW, I will add just real quick, just
yeah.
as a side note, I was in a deposition, sitting in on the deposition of another surveyor, and the title company was, I think it was there was a title issue, and the title company was the one suing the surveyor, and they have a lot of money. So, and sitting on the other side, we had two experts on our side. I was working for the title company attorneys. We had two experts on our side. We had four attorneys on our side, and the poor surveyor was sitting across the table there with his newly minted, ink wet, newly minted attorney provided by his E&O carrier. And one of the questions, I'm sure he was nervous, but one of the questions, they asked me for questions, and it got to some point in the deposition where it seemed like it mattered. And I leaned over to one of the attorneys doing the question, said, ask him if he knows the difference between a corner and a monument. And he, of course, he answered, he did, there's no difference between the two. I thought that was kind of funny. That might have been right about the time I wrote this, to make a point on it, that there is a difference between a corner and a monument. A monument is a thing, a corner is a legal concept. So we should keep that, you're right, we should keep that in mind.
Okay. I like it. Thanks for sharing. So we'll just jump into the introduction here, and the chapter here. Jeff notes the history of monuments, quoting to the Bible. So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. He said to his relatives, gather some stones. So they took the stones and piled them in a heap. Laban said to Jacob, here is this heap, here is this pillar I set up between you and me. This heap is a witness.
Stop right there, TW. Stop right there. Notice something. Jacob took up the stones. He got his relatives. They gathered the stones. They made the pile. And then what does Laban do? Laban said to Jacob, here's the heap here that I have set up between me. He takes credit. I mean, if you know anything about Jacob and Laban, right? That is just it's hilarious to me. He takes credit for the pillar.
Look what I've done.
Yeah. Anyway,
like
sorry
it.
to interrupt you, TW. Sorry to interrupt. You got to find humor in this stuff, though. You got to find humor.
Yeah. So Laban said to Jacob, here's this heap, here's this pillar I have set up between you and me. This heap is a witness, and this pillar is a witness that I will not go past this heap to your side to harm you, and that ye will not go past this heap and pillar to my side to harm me. And I really like this idea.
And it was so for 4,000 years, until some surveyor came along and said, you got it in the wrong place.
Yeah. So I like this. So I've shared this before. I'm a good Utah boy, and there's a term in the major religion here that we use quite a bit, and it's by the mouth of two or more witnesses. And I think this really applies here, because in this case, whether Laban was taking credit or not, they both witnessed together. Both sides of that have come together to agree. And their action is actually building a heap. Today's actions might be building a fence. It could even be where you mow the lawn to, right? And I keep mine nice and short and clean, and my neighbor lets his grow nice and tall. But we always mow to the same line. Our wheels follow the same wheel crevice in the lawn, right, when we pass it. So together our actions witness to our intent. And I love that language in there, the witness of it, that shows intent to it. So those are tied really, really well together. So in the next chapter, next paragraph here, it says it defines prima facie. It's a fixed visible monument that can never be rejected as false or mistaken in favor of mere course and distance as a starting point when there's nothing else in terms of the grant to control and override the fixed invisible call. So this is that balance of evidence that we have here. I mean, if you find a monument, it generally fits those measurements. It's pretty obvious that that is the true location. We get a couple different parts in this chapter where we'll look at why that monument may not be the actual location. There's a couple paragraphs in here that talk about that. But all in all, we're looking at all the evidence we can, and the most prevalent evidence, the most important evidence we can have is the actual monument on the ground, because the landowners can see that and witness to it. And so that's why, I mean, when we talk about pincushions, that's the hardest thing to understand of why we create pincushions, because that's the easiest piece of evidence to find is those visible, relied upon monuments in the ground.
Well, I'll add to that, and it's not in this book. As a matter of fact, it's something I basically came across and recognized the importance of it in doing retracement surveying several years ago. I wrote an article, I guess, in POB magazine about presumptions and inferences. A presumption is a legal fact. A legal presumption is a legal fact until you prove it wrong. And as Robillard used to say all the time, it's a presumption, but it's a rebuttable presumption. So there are rebuttable presumptions and there are irrebuttable presumptions. One of those being the sun rises in the east. Nobody can really argue that. But the point is, a presumption, a legal presumption, is a legal fact until proven wrong. And the burden will be on the one trying to prove the legal fact wrong, not on the one using the presumption. And this is very important for retracement surveyors to understand, because the doctrine of monuments, the common grantor doctrine, and the doctrine of monuments stand on a presumption. They stand on a legal presumption. I think there might even be a quote in here about that. They stand on the legal presumption that it is imbued with original intent, and it is the manifestation of the intent of the grantor and the grantee. That is a legal presumption. So just if you did nothing else but to accept the monument, somebody and your survey goes to court, and you're up against a paper corner on the other side, they're going to have the burden. The other side will have the burden of proving your legal fact to be incorrect, and the paper corner being the correct position. So that's going to be a tough road to hoe for the other side with the paper corner.
Well, thank you. And that next paragraph kind of speaks to that, because it talks about when it's contemporaneously set with the conveyance of the property, right? Those are so close in time together. And that's just more evidence to the fact that, hey, this is the original monument. It's done when the property was set. You even use, they are imbued with the original intent of the grantor and the grantee. That's just more weight to the reliance on existing monuments when we find them. So jumping over to the next section here, monuments and the priority of calls. As a threshold matter, we should consider just what constitutes a monument in the land boundary context. And we've talked about this already tonight, but the glossary of the mapping sciences defines a monument as any material object or collection of objects indicating the location on the ground of a survey station or corner. In land surveying, the term is also used for objects such as roads, ditches, or fences forming a boundary of the land. Monuments can be further defined as either natural or artificial. Natural monuments are the rivers, streams, trees, boulders whose location, size, and characteristics have been formed by nature. Artificial monuments refer to the items such as iron pipes, steel rebars, wooden posts, railroad spikes, created and placed by the hand of man. Natural objects such as rocks, when placed in a pile, are also considered artificial monuments because they were placed in a certain location as opposed to naturally occurring at that location. And so this goes back to not just our retracement survey procedures, but also our rules of construction for constructing deeds, right? The more clarity and bounds we can have in a deed, the better that will stand in the future. Whether it's an original description we're doing as part of a break off of a bigger piece of land, and we're describing a portion of it for a new original survey, if we can use that term, or even my really crappy description here that we showed earlier. You know, if I had shown the whole thing, it was running along an existing storm drain line. You know, so we call that out in the language. There's no confusing what the intent is when we can add all these calls to natural and artificial monuments in there. It says next paragraph here, and I'm surprisingly there's some debate in the land surveying community over whether certain objects can or should be considered as monuments. High tension power transmission towers entered in the debate. I mentioned the storm drain in my easement. Jeff says, I worked for Bonneville Power Authority in Washington State. How about an underground pipe that no one can see? This point specifically, and an overall good discussion on monuments, is found in the Missouri case, Zarnecki versus Phillip Pipeline Company. So I figured this is a great thing to kind of throw it out to you guys. What have your experiences been? What are your thoughts on monuments being even something that can't be seen?
Well, let me back up to Bonneville Power for just a second. I think it's interesting that they can be seen. So they were having a problem in that they had these script descriptions of right-of-way back in the 1920s, early 1900s, 1920s. And their surveyors went out to a section corner, went along the section line to the center line of the proposed power right of way, and they turned an angle, and then they went and they staked out the line, you know, on 100-foot intervals, and they staked it, they staked it, they staked it. Then they would come to a PI or a delta, and they would turn another angle, and they would stake it, stake it, stake it, stake it, stake it, sticking out the center line. So they did that. They would do that for these long stretches of power of right-of-way easement that they were going to condemn. And so then the next thing that would have happened after the stakes is there would have been a viewing. Landowners would have seen the stakes. The representatives of the power company would have come out there, and they're looking at the stake. Yeah, this is where we're going to have a right-of-way. It's going to be 100 feet each side, whatever it was, 50 feet each side of this line here. Then the next thing that happens is they came out there and they cleared the line, and they erected high tension power lines right on the center line, and they did that for all of their rights of way, right? And so then fast forward 100 years, and almost 100 years, and their surveyors are going back out there, getting on a section line, getting on a section corner, going down the section line, turning that angle, and then they're going about 3 miles. And after they go 3 miles, turning angles and distances, you know, going by the math, and completely ignoring the monument that's sitting there, the invisible monument, these, I don't know, 90-foot, 100-foot high transmission towers. They're 3 miles down the line. They're not even underneath the power lines any longer. And they're marking that off as their right-of-way, and they're saw cutting people's houses to get them out of their right-of-way. That was their problem. Seems ridiculous, and it seems unbelievable, but that was their problem. And they couldn't wrap some of their surveyors, and they were having a debate within their department as to how we handle this. And I'm like, you staked out the line, you staked the line out, you condemned the line, you built the line, and there you are, they're out there. The towers are still there to this day, you know, 100 years later. But but you've got the right. By the time you do all the math and you're 3 miles down the road, you're not even under the power lines anymore. And they're thinking that's where the right of way is. I don't know how incredible it sounds to you, but that sounded totally incredible to me.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, having worked in the power line industry, I mean those older lines rarely fit what they wrote back then. They often wrote them to the easiest course they thought they'd go, and someone built them even somewhere different just because you got out there. It was easier to cross this part of the river. And
Well, how about this? 100 years later, TW, 100 years later, is that section corner in the same section location it was in 1921 when they first came off of it? Probably not. And why not? Because it's been prorated back in by some county surveyor, and now it's 50 feet away from where it was in 1921. Do you see the ridiculousness of what we're doing as a profession? It totally drives me crazy. I don't know if you can tell that or not. It does drive me a little crazy.
Well, and that's a pretty obvious one. I just finished a project here where we're doing some concept planning and trying to plot in easements for some underground pipelines, gas pipelines. And you go back a couple of decades in aerial photos, and you can very clearly see the scar despite what the descriptions say. And so where those pipelines were built, and so we've honored the pipeline requirements for offsets to that based off of their actual location. So that is a physical monument, though unseen by the naked eye, or the easily naked eye to see on the ground. You've got to go do some digging and research and gather more evidence to be able to determine what the intent was. And the intent was to go where the pipeline is and protect the pipeline.
And that's what this
keep
case
them
was all
accessible.
about. That's what this case was all about.
Yeah, I like
It was a
it.
pipeline. It was buried, but it was still a monument. It was still down there. And I think they were trying to claim I think they were doing the math. They were claiming, that by the time they got 3 miles down the pipeline, they weren't even over top of the pipe any longer.
Okay. Anyone have any other questions, comments, stories, thoughts about some of these types of monuments? Okay, we'll keep jumping on here. I'm going to keep giving you guys an opportunity to talk, so it's not just Jeff and I.
Yeah, I'm not going to yell at anybody if they talk. Okay, I promise.
I'll do the yelling for them. I'm just kidding. So jumping over here to the next page, it says, no discussion of monuments can be complete without a recitation of the priority of calls in the descriptive parts of instruments of conveyance, the legal description, the rules of construction. So put everyone on the spot here. What are our rules of construction? We've covered them here in this book already. We covered them last year in Waddles.
I need to call on somebody, TW.
We might have to. Dave's ready.
You have natural monuments. Yep. You have artificial monuments. You have calls to adjoiners. You have angles, distances, and area. I think after 2 or 3 years now, about 3 books now, it's finally started to sink in. I can almost do it verbatim now. So, but yeah, it definitely helped going with this chapter, going over it again and again and again. So it's like, yeah, I'm getting there, maybe someday.
Well, and the other one to throw there at the bottom is also coordinates. We're seeing that more and more, coordinates as well.
You might want to also consider that. I look at that as the shortened surveyor's version of the rules of construction, but it actually includes a number of different things beyond that. There in California, Montana, Idaho, or not Idaho, Oregon, and North Dakota all have in their state statutes a codified version of the rules of construction, which are controlling all sorts of things like grants and junior senior rights, number of different things that are well beyond the surveyor's short list. And then there's also another. They're scattered throughout the court cases. You'll see them refer continuously to these rules of construction, and they'll list out a rule of construction that certainly isn't on our list, but it includes things like navigable waterways and high water marks and things like that, even. And what they mean and meanings of terms, all sorts of things that are all considered by the courts as rules of construction. But yeah, we have our basic little short list we look at, and um, there's other principles that we consider, but we don't consider them as what they really are, rules of construction.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that.
I was going to say, week 87 on Mentoring Mondays was Dane talking about rules of construction as well. I thought we've done it a couple times, but I know week 87 for sure.
Okay, some great stuff there. We've talked about in every book here for Wisdom on Wednesday. We've touched on that too. So critical to understand that. So monuments, these physical locations, right? The visible, physical, touchable, seeable, whatever it might be, locations, they hold the highest regard in these rules of construction. And to simplify it is because the landowner can go out there and can recognize it, right? They can look at a deed or a plat map that says thence to a fence, thence to a street, to a high water mark. They may not understand what a high water mark, but they're at least making a connection to the river, the water, the body of water, whatever it is. It's easy for them to go out there and see it and understand it and walk it and recreate it, where a bunch of bearings and distances for a landowner is that's gobbledygook, right? They don't get that. They don't even, bearings and distances, or bearings in particular, is even less understood by the general public than, say, an azimuth, because at least some point in most people's life they've held a compass, sometime in elementary school or Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts. We've at least seen one, have a basic understanding of that, but that's a different readout than bearings. And so that's harder for them to take a deed that they own and put that on the ground. And so that's why these calls are so important. Monuments are so important in the way we write our descriptions and what we look at when we're retracing. So we talked at the very beginning, and this is the next portion reiterates this. Monuments being the highest legal status. The courts see them as physical manifestations of the intent of the grantor. And then paper corners, sometimes referred to as theoretical corners, says are not as well understood, if at all. From the anecdotal evidence gathered from a 30-plus year career in land surveying, it's safe to say that the majority of landowners cannot read or do not fully understand the land surveyor's map of survey. In many cases, it takes another surveyor to interpret the map. It is not the case when it comes to monuments. Landowners understand the monuments well. And we've talked about this time and time again in a lot of these classes, and we think that we're misunderstood by the public. His book says this brings us to an undeniable truth about land surveyors and land surveying. Land surveyors like to think that they are misunderstood by the public and other professionals, and as a consequence garner little respect. The truth is that landowners know two things about land surveyors. First, surveyors are the people who stand on the side taking pictures. And second, when land surveyors survey boundaries, they determine where property corners are located. And when the surveyor leaves the field, the monuments left behind are representative of those corners. And then on top of that, they fully expect some other surveyor by experience to come in and set a different corner and create confusion, right? That's what they know of us. And it's our own doing.
Well, I've got a comment about this because as I was reading this, what first came to mind is how many times I've set a corner or excuse me, I've set a marker off of the corner because there was something in the way, like a 1 foot or a 2 foot offset of the line. And then a fencing contractor came through and built the fence to my marker and didn't read my survey, of course, and the landowners didn't correct them. And it didn't matter how much I had tried to communicate that this marker wasn't at the corner. It was just a reference to it. But they build the fence between these markers. And all of a sudden you've got a fence that's a foot or 2 feet off the line. And people have this perception, and I think rightly so, that they wanted to put the fence on the line. And so they expected that the fence that the contractor installed was on the line, but it's not. Maybe one side it is, but the other corner of their property, it's not. And I'm dealing with one right now where that's part of the conversation. They're going to do a boundary line agreement, probably to the fence. The fence was surveyed in, it was marked, but one of those markers for some reason was set back 2 feet, and all of a sudden the fence is no longer on the line. So that's what comes to mind here.
There's certainly that, and there's a challenge here. The one thing I always talk to my crews about is the order of operations, right? Of when do we set property corners? It's always this challenge from a business standpoint. You have a plat, you've prepared the plat, it's ready to go record at the county. They're just wrapping up construction, they're just wrapping up grading, and maybe that plat gets recorded, but in the meantime, something happens, and they go to set a property corner, and there's a need to set a property corner off of this plat on line 2 feet off, like Jeremiah just mentioned. And how does that get communicated on there? Because your plat's already recorded. Your plat does not denote anything different than there is a marker, a monument at every corner, and that's it. And so it's very easy to have confusion. So we have that conversation all the time with my crews of be careful what you set. Don't just set it because it's convenient. If you got to crawl under that bush and risk life and limb to get that corner in the right location, I'd rather you do that than set something wrong and cause confusion in the future. I joke about life and limb, but don't just be lazy and set in a corner because it's easier. There's a bush in the way that you can't get to the true corner of that.
I'm gonna here's one visual. We're working on this survey at the moment. It's not recorded. The client doesn't want it recorded yet, and you'll see why. Share. This is a little row of vertical logs that they stood up. Thankfully, it's not a permanent fence, but they built it to, these are all double corners in the back. And so they've built all of their fences to the incorrect lot corners. This is the real PL, which is this is up in a mountain community. So there's cabins and decks and stuff. And so they thought this was their property corner, but this is really their property corner. So you got decks that are currently constructed and over property lines and stuff like that. So to the point, sometimes there's double corners and property owners not knowing exactly what they own to, right? So
yep,
there's a hard visual of a mess that can happen with that.
That's one we see quite often as well.
Yep.
You know, and here just from, I mean, that just a good pause as well is how do we as surveyors do our, you know, if you will, our original survey of a subdivision like that, and looking at possible double corners like that. So, for example, the company I work for, we are a full service civil engineering and land surveying team. But out of the office I work out, because we were a smaller satellite office, the civil drafters and the civil team or designers were really doing a lot more of the lot layout for plats. And then the licensed surveyor would come in and do his final review of everything and do his legal responsibility to check it. But we've tried to switch that now as we've grown in my office, that I'm laying out the plats. I'm working with the client to look at lot layouts and boundaries and that stuff so that we can, because I understand the double corners and how that happens. And if we can avoid it in certain layouts, we have that discussion up front instead of the back end when sometimes it's too late to correct that. Curious, throw the question out here as part of the discussion because this will lead into the next paragraph I want to hit on. But what about you guys? I mean, TK, you're just straight survey, right? But you pair up with engineers and do that. So how does that look for you guys where you're just a survey company?
I will say on that instance, we don't do residential mapping. So we're more commercial, parcel maps, that kind of stuff. So we wouldn't run into as much double corners when it comes to residential corners. So
yeah. So there are a couple of survey companies I know even out here that they do contract work with an engineer. They're just handed a plat to sign and certify and go.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely a valid point though, and that's part of that, inner internal conversations, right? And so that's some of those lunch and learns that we've talked about, even with your internal client being your own engineers, and having kind of those lunch and learns with those and get them to understand that stuff. So it's important.
Absolutely. So anyone else have any thoughts, questions, or experiences before we jump on here?
Working with the county, we just had an interesting meeting today with waste and recycling, and they had their own drone team and their own contract surveyors that set up aerial mapping for their landfills. This is all about landfills, big landfill sites. And for whatever reason, they decided that they want to change and pull it back into the county. And so they wanted my office. We had a big meeting today with their office and trying to explain, okay, this is what we do. This is how we do it. And we know that you have your own control out there. And we know that you had a surveyor or you have somebody flying a drone for you. So we want to check it all out. And there's 4 different groups in waste and recycle, and all civil engineers were at the meeting. You had basically 4 different companies there doing 4 totally different things, and no one knew what the hell the other one was doing. And it was hilarious from my standpoint. I am laughing my ass off here listening to these guys talk, because every time we said something, it was silence. It was dead silence because they didn't know what they had. The only thing they knew for sure is that once a year they need to have the whole site flown, and then they want to have a licensed surveyor sign the map. And so we said, okay, yeah, we can help you with that. But man, it was pulling teeth out of those guys today, trying to get the data information. And okay, is this what you guys want? I don't know. It's like, what the hell? So yeah, sometimes you have to just tell them, okay, this is what we're going to do. And as long as what you're doing meets our level of confidence, then I'm going to sign it. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff like that where we have to reteach, re-explain what they need to know and what it takes to do what they want to do.
Okay, thanks for sharing. See,
Well done.
that's why I'll never be in government, Dave. That's
That's why they pay me the big bucks.
yeah. So that brings us into our next paragraph here. Really great. So there's this balance and challenge when we have these discussions of, the corner, is the monument, that is it, and that's held, and nothing else can be the property corner besides that monument we find. But there are times where we have to evaluate other pieces of evidence that come in. The map that Trent just showed Just because you found a monument there and they've been occupying to that one doesn't make that the correct monument in this case. There's enough overwhelming evidence to show that there was something held to or interpreted wrong in that case. So it says here in this middle of page 170, it says land surveyors need to keep in mind that a monument and a property corner are not necessarily the same thing. Surveyors should know better. Jeff says, including me, often use, oh, this isn't the one I was thinking of reading, but we'll read this anyways. Including me, often use the term interchangeably. Black defines a corner in the surveying context as an angle made by two boundary lines. The common end of two boundary lines which run at an angle with each other. Blacks further defines a monument as any physical object on the ground which helps to establish the boundary line called for. It may be either natural or artificial. I thought we're getting to the paragraph here where we talked about, weighing the evidence and when when the monument isn't actually the deed cornered there. But that just kind of wraps up what we were talking about there. So thank you guys. 6.03 called for monuments. I think this is what I was thinking of. Intent, however, can be defeated under the right circumstances, and so can original monuments set by an original subdividing surveyor. So this is kind of where I was trying to get to. This is especially true when the monuments being set affect outside boundaries. If the monuments overstate or understate the land being conveyed, that is, create overlaps and gaps along the exterior boundaries, they generally do not represent the intent of the grantor and can be defeated by true intent. A grantor may intend to convey more land than he owns, but one cannot sell what one does not own. True intent would be to the extent of the estate, but not beyond. Conversely, a grantor may have intended to convey all of her estate, but the monuments were placed, creating a gap. If the true intent was to convey the entire estate, the monuments creating the gap can be defeated. So there is a time and a place where the monuments on there need to be reevaluated, perhaps ignored, and conveying past what you have rights to convey or creating gaps when was none intended. And so in everything we do, it's the weight of evidence, and we've talked about it in this book about that 51%, right? You just have to be more right than the other guy, more defendable than the other guy. And so here's some great armament to be able to do that, situations where you might ignore the original monuments.
I'd like to say that I fully respect those monuments that are original in nature, but I'm also concerned with monuments that are the original physical monument that has been moved. And if we can't discern the difference between a monument that is in its original location as against a monument that has been moved, then we aren't doing the public any good. So just finding a monument doesn't mean anything really until you validate that monument. Well, how do you tell whether a monument occupies its original location or doesn't? And even if it doesn't, monument is not the original piece of iron that marked the monument. If it's a replacement, it has the same authority as the original. So we get down to a situation where we're evaluating, is this the original location or is it not? And there you only need to prove, like has been stated, 51%. But what evidence do you have that shows whether it is in the original location or not? And there's a lot of information that can be compared to show one way or the other.
Yeah, it's all that evidence gathering, right? Can you confirm the location of that with extrinsic evidence, other things outside of that that help prove that case, and gathering all that in.
Let me give a, a, a couple of instances like that. Say you've got a straight line in a subdivision tract that's a long lot, and each of the lots is shown on the plat as 60 foot. And you locate a lot of pins along the front. Some of them are missing, some of them are there. But you find that in between two monuments, the distance is not right. One of those monuments must be either wrong or else there was a mistake or blunder made when it was originally done. If it was originally done, those monuments hold. If it is a short lot or long lot because the monuments were moved, then it's not controlling. So you look at the entire thing and see if there is a system there that corresponds to 60 foot for all lots across the area that appears to be have an error in it. And so if a surveyor is marking off a lot 60 foot wide, and he gets one and he makes a blunder, and he sets one at 58 feet, says 60, and then he goes on to the next one, he's going to measure 60 foot. So you're going to have only one place in there that it's going to be off. But if the monument has been moved, the next distance up to the next found iron pin will be 62 feet, or a compensation for what the error was in the other side of the pin. And that just doesn't happen. When you're measuring off lots, you don't measure off one and make one blunder and then immediately after that have a corresponding error or blunder that exactly coincides with the one that you made before. That pin has been moved. So that's one way to look at it. When a monument that you find does not fit the overall scope of the survey that you're working with, you need to ask yourself, is there a location that I can set on the ground that if the pin was set at that location, all the information on the plat would be correct? And if that is the case, you should suspect that the pin that you have found has been moved to an erroneous location. Now, I don't know whether I explained that correctly or whether you can understand it or not, but that's been my experience.
Well, thanks, James, for sharing that. The moved of a monument, I don't see that too much where I'm at, and that would be a big leap for me. But I get the principle. What you're trying to convey is if it doesn't fit, can you evaluate that properly? Can you find alternate solutions that everyone equitably gets what they're supposed to, or some true location of that corner? And there's a lot of evidence that goes into that. Occupation, intent, extrinsic evidence. Fences. To help kind of see. There's time as well that's involved in that. So thank you for sharing.
I'll add one story about moved monuments, and I probably talked about it before, but we had a client that we were working with, and the BLM went in around his mine area and monument and everything. Well, he had already dug outside of it, so he had moved the BLM monument to, so it didn't look like he had encroached on anything, but he didn't realize that they had buried the magnet, and so everybody they were able to find the original magnet to where the original corner was supposed to be. So, kudos to the old school magnets still being used today in the BLM practices. So
Where I found monuments that had been moved or monuments that are not the original markers of an older subdivision, it's not in it was not done intently, but it's done by surveyors because the pins that originally were out there were not exact. Maybe they were off only a tenth or two here or there. But some surveyor comes out and tries to replace some monuments that were missing, and he magnifies that error by setting up on one, backsighting the other one, and measuring off the record distance and angle. And after a number of years, the whole thing starts to get kind of whopper jawed. It's kind of like if you take a photograph that's very clear and you take it over to a Xerox machine and copy it, it still looks good. But if you take that copy and copy it again, and take that copy and copy it again, and you keep doing that, after a certain time, you can't hardly recognize that as a photo anymore. And that's what's happening out there to a lot of subdivisions after 30 or 40 or 50 years. But originally, that was probably the original markers probably were very close to what's shown on that map. The fact that people in the 1920s or 30s didn't know how to measure urban lots off is poppycock. They were good measurers. You can train a couple of teenagers to accurately measure 50 or 60 feet in an hour. And the fact that they made mistakes of a foot or so, no, it didn't happen very often.
Yeah. Okay.
We've got a sneaky contractor down in Newport Beach right now. It's a concrete contractor, and he's going out, and down Newport Beach there's a lot of concrete. All the alleys are concrete, sidewalks concrete, and this guy is smart enough that he's finding old tags, surveyors have been dead. He's somehow tying them out, roughly, pouring his concrete, and resetting the tags. Yeah, resetting the tags. And so you got this old survey tag. Guy's been dead for decades in brand new concrete. And we've seen it. I've seen it half dozen times already. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, down in this area, there's a lot of lot surveys. There's been a lot of people out there surveying and setting a lot of offset monuments to corners. And so you have to take everything. You have a lot of evidence to go through to figure out who is good, who is bad, and which way is up. But you find these guys that are out by tenths when they should only be out by hundreds, and you go, what the hell happened here? And boy, it's someday we're gonna find this guy and string him up. But man, yeah, it's an interesting one.
Yeah, that is interesting. I see it. I guess I do. I'll take it back. I do see occasionally where the fence guys will pull a monument for a fence and try and set it on top of there. And sometimes they'll set that monument against the fence. But let's keep going here for the sake of actually getting through a portion of this chapter today. So I might piss people off with this next section, but I'm going to throw a couple things out here. And as I do it, please know I'm just as guilty as everybody else, and I'm trying to do better at not doing this. But when we talk about calls for monuments, we can call to a brass cap being the section corner as our point of commencement, or a half-inch rebar set as a property corner, and calling out the yellow cap with a license number on there. And then we talk about here, right in the middle of the page, another less obvious example of a call for a monument is called for adjoiners. And when I was working for a nationwide company, we were doing stuff out in Ohio and West Virginia, I was really impressed with the calls for adjoiners. Now, some of those adjoiners could have been great, Pappy, whoever's property, and he hasn't been alive for 150 years, and you got to figure out what he owned back then. But everything was called to very clearly. If the measurements were not great, the calls were wonderful, and they were retraceable because you can fit in all these old farm pieces and whatnot through there. But we need to be careful sometimes when we make calls to adjoiners when we're preparing deeds. Is it can't be lazy production of it. We can't just call to an adjoiner because I don't know where it is, so I'm just going to call to it. I'm going to put a measurement. Maybe it's a record measurement. Maybe it's the measured one, but I'm just going to start calling to a joiner so that I can close everything out and say I've done a good job. Because I've seen that as well, where we actually create confusion because I'm calling to a joiners, but I'm not actually doing anything to look at what's on the ground. Or calling just to the south line of the grantor's land and let it be what it is, right? So while these are really good calls to have, we need to be judicious in the way we do it. We really do need to think 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now what those next couple generations of surveyors are going to think of the work we've done, because they've got to unravel our mess at some point, just like we're unraveling the mess from 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. Some of you guys might have been surveying 30, 40 years ago, so I'll be careful with that, but just some stuff to consider there. And I call myself out just as guilty as anyone else. And as I work through Wisdom Wednesdays here with you guys and learn, I've improved what I do, and that's just my hope in calling that one out.
It's your own therapy session, huh?
It really is. My call to repentance. Jeff, is there anything else you'd like to throw in here about calls to monuments? And if not, we've had plenty of discussion. I'd like to jump over to uncalled for monuments.
No, I will say this, just kind of a history lesson or just a practice lesson. I grew up in surveying down in Florida, and I went to work full time. My first full time job was with the largest engineering and surveying company in the Tampa Bay area in Hillsborough County. It's called Height and Associates. One point in time, we had 50 survey crews. I mean, it was a juggernaut. And before I got licensed, I was a party chief. They brought me in to work in the computer room and to do computations. And back then we had what was called a plotter, and you had to tell it what pen to pick up, and then what lines you want. You had to calculate everything first. You did that on grid paper and scaled it all out, and then you got coordinates on everything. That we had that little 4-inch CRT on that wild calculator, and so calculating away. But the point is, that's where I started learning how to write legal descriptions and things like that. And so the largest company, one of the oldest companies in Hillsborough County, where Tampa's seated, I was being taught how to write legal descriptions, and they never once mentioned, we'll call for the monuments. I didn't learn that till later, but the largest company in Tampa was spitting out deeds, spitting out legal descriptions with not calling for one monument at any corner on any of our legal descriptions. I didn't even realize that till 10 years later. Wow, we never even called out for monuments in our legal descriptions. So, but as far as the material in here, nothing new. But you can. What I will say is, and I think we're at that point here, is you do have to be careful with rewriting legal descriptions because, and the title, if you're working with altas, the title companies are gonna want you to rewrite a legal description almost every time you do an alta because they think something's wrong with the title if the title documents don't match what you have on the ground or vice versa. But I think it gets into it here with some more rules of construction that call for a monument as the center of the monument, the call for the stream as the center of the stream, call for the road as the center of the road. You can really, especially with riparian rights, which I deal a lot with, I've been dealing a lot with over the last 10, 15 years. If you can write a legal description that will, where you should just be calling for, calling for the ocean or the mean high tide line, or you should just be calling for the river and not trying to distinguish between whether it's navigable in fact or not navigable, and that's a determination of actually a determination of the ownership of the bed. You can really screw things up if you're not careful and you're writing a meets and bounds description where there was simply a call to the river, and then you are going to make a real particular description out of that thing and go to the top of the bank and then it's along the top of the bank and then back off the top of the bank, and you now maybe a conveyance takes place, you can actually cut off the riparian, you can bifurcate the riparian rights from the upland ownership, and you could really screw up title. Same thing that you could say about roads. Probably the vast majority of roads in the United States of America exist in some sort of easement or prescriptive form. And so the title is going to the center line of the road. And if you write a legal description to the right of way, and you don't get that right because it really isn't a right of way, there's an easement, you can you can really mess up the title if you're not careful.
Thank you. Yeah, some things to consider there is our precision in language, and I'll reiterate, Jeff, as you started talking there, I just remembered, you're talking about